So some examples in terms of the social area. One of the things that's happening all across this country now, and I've had a particular opportunity to see this happening now in terms of my involvement with the Stone Barns and other parts of the country, and that is that the concept of a food shed has now become a part of our language. Now the concept of a food shed has been around since 1929, but it never really caught on until the food crisis of 2007 and 2008. And I think what happened then was that even politicians like Scott Stringer, who's the president of the Manhattan Borough, looked at what was happening globally and said, my God, this can happen in my community in Manhattan because we've got some food deserts here as well, and we have to do something to prevent that from happening. So he's become a radical advocate of the food shed concept because he knows that if New York City can come up with a way of thinking about their food system and redesigning their food system that actually sees food as a relationship and deals with the problems that are a part of that, then they're going to be in a much better position to meet the challenges of the future. And so he organized a food conference about 2 years ago in New York, which started a process which has now accumulated into a food charter that New York City has developed, and the City Council just released it a couple of weeks ago for public comment. And it's pretty clear at some point the City Council is going to take that charter and modify it in terms of public comment and then create a food charter for the city. Now, in my view, it's not perfect, but it's really good. It asks for a citywide composting program, how to make land available for beginning farmers. You know, it looks at it as a whole systems approach. That's going to give us, and the whole idea around this is looking at the New York City area as a food shed, as a community of people who function as food citizens, who take their civic responsibility, become involved in determining what kind of food system is going to serve the needs of the greater New York City best. And I like the food shed, and I don't mean this to offend anybody here. I know a lot of us are committed to the concept of local, and I am too in a way. But we had a comment last night from a farmer in Virginia who's selling into, who was selling into Maryland, said, well, am I still local or not, you know? Well, you know, in a food shed concept, you know, the citizens involved in that shed would make that decision. And rather than saying simply because you're beyond the boundary of 150 miles or whatever it is, then you're outside. And for me, you know, that boundary, because if you think about New York City with, what, 25 million people, and if you take the boundary at 150 miles, if you go beyond that, is it still local? And if it's just 150 miles, you're going to feed 25 billion people, million people. And then you take my home state of North Dakota, where we only have 620,000 people in the whole state. If everybody ate within 150 miles, 90% of the farmland, you know, wouldn't be usable. So we have to start thinking, I think, more creatively. I think this notion of people becoming food citizens, becoming engaged to determine what the best food system is for that shed, whatever the size of that shed is. And then you produce as much of the food as possible by people in the food shed, for people in the food shed, and your exports and imports, which we're still going to have, become the second priority. I think it's a better model for us to look at. But again, a lot of that is happening, and there are many, many other examples in terms of the economy that are happening along those lines, and socially along those lines. And then in the ecological area, this is also happening, and the permaculture breakout session that we just had this morning was a good example of some of the new ecological models that are developing, in which instead of looking at soil, for example, as simply a material that holds a plant in place, as our soil scientists, you know, 15 years ago were still saying, and then you bring in whatever you need in order to produce that, you really look at what kind of system do we put together that's more self-regulating and self-renewing, in which different parts of the system feed other parts of the system. And again, let me use a good example. I'm sure you all know this. I don't need to give you a lot of examples. But Joel Salatin Farms near Swope, Virginia, is a good example of that kind of ecological system. And I visited Joel's farm some years ago, and I haven't been there since, so I don't know whether it's changed since then or not. You know, farm things have to change. But he was telling me, and of course, you know, his system, as you know, is an intensive rotational grazing system where he's divided his pastures up into small paddocks. And then he showed me the paddocks, and he said, you know, I put my beef animals in the paddock first, and they're in there for 24 hours, then I move them to the next paddock, and then 90 hours later I bring in the chicken. I said, 90 hours? Why 90 hours? Oh, he said, because that's exactly the time when the grubs and the larvae and the cowpies have developed their perfect feed for chickens. So that's primarily what they feed on, so I don't have to feed them a lot. And then besides, he said, in the process of eating the grubs and the manure out of the grubs and the larvae out of the manure pies, they scratch the pie apart in order to get the grubs and the larvae. In the process, they spread the manure for me, so I don't have to spread the manure, so it's more fertilizer for more grass. And his whole system is put together that way. Now, a lot of people, you know, a lot of things about Joel they don't like, but in terms, and whether you do or not, that's not important. In terms of what he's put together as an ecological system are the designs of the future that we have to look at. So we can talk a lot about it. You know, the Land Institute at Salina, Kansas is another one of those examples of the new ecological models. You know, Wes Jackson now has been doing research there with his scientists for 30 years. And they're now at a point where many of the annual grain crops are now being converted to perennials. Perennial plants are much more serviceable in terms of ecological health in the biological soil because the root systems go much deeper, they're much more intensive, so they provide all of those services, whereas in an annual crop, you know, your root systems only go down about, you know, 10 or 15 inches, and they're only about 3 inches in diameter. So you can imagine the difference which that makes in terms of the biological health of an operation. And so, you know, again, the wisdom of all the label becomes important here because he said that the most important thing that we need to do in the interest of conservation is to enhance the capacity of the land community to renew itself. And this is something that we've ignored through our whole industrial era. And you know, I would say that all of us as farmers ought to put that up someplace as a bumper sticker, you know, that's our goal, that's our commitment to enhance the capacity of our land to renew itself. So, is all of this just a lot of romance, you know, or is this real? Because, you know, I realize that when you make paradigm shifts, you're talking about a lot of changes. And most of us, particularly when you get to be my age, you know, you're not that interested in making a lot of changes, unless you're a little weird like I am. Important thing for us here, I think, is to think about how change actually happens. And many of us, I think about change in terms of what all the barriers are. And we think about it in terms of, again, our cultural history, thinking about change in terms of a linear cause-effect relationship. So we think that the only way that change happens is somebody has to come along, some lone ranger, you know, who really brings about, who pushes something in a different direction. It's that cause-effect set of relationships then which bring about the change. And if you don't have the Lone Ranger, well, it's probably just not going to happen. Well, I would recommend to you reading a book by a man by the name of Richard Ugal, who wrote a book published in 2007 by the Harvard Business School Press called Smart World. And Richard Ugal uses the science of networks rather than this linear cause-effect relationship science. And then he looked at how change actually happens in actual situations. And he gives a number of very interesting examples, some which I don't like that much, like, you know, how Barbie dolls got revolution in the toy industry. But he uses some that are very, very instructive, I think. One of them is how Cubism happened in art. And he said, we always attribute Cubism in art to Picasso, again, that Lone Ranger who made that happen. But he said, when you actually look at how that happened, that's not how it happened at all. That at that time, there were a lot of things that were happening in the field of art. A lot of artists were becoming dissatisfied with the traditional and conventional approaches to art. Some were already experimenting with some other alternatives. And it created this environment, which Richard Ugal calls an idea space. It created this new idea space. And then Picasso came into that idea space and put Cubism on canvas, and it revolutionized the world for art and art forever. Now, when I read this, I said, this is exactly what's happening in our food system today. Nobody here can deny that we are creating some radically, and you're part of it, some radically new idea spaces in our food system. 10 years ago, it would not have been possible for a Michael Pollan to write a book about food and have it be on the New York Times bestseller list for years. It would not have happened. It's because this idea space is already here. So let's not lose sight of that. We have these enormous capacities now for major changes, for a revolution in the food system to take place. And all of us, like those in this group, we seem like such a small minority, but so were that small group of artists who developed the idea space that Picasso came into. And so I think we have the possibility, in fact, the inevitability, if you look at the kind of challenges we're going to see in the future, to have a major revolution in our food system, and it's going to look a whole lot like what many of you are doing on a very small scale right now as we move into the future. So I look forward to those of you who want to explore some of this further, and particularly if you have some things that you disagree with what I said. You know, I'm a Russian German. I've never had a good day unless I have at least one argument. So I look forward to that with you all. Thank you.